Aerated blocks are incredibly absorbent, so to make sure they don't soak up all of the moisture out of my render too quickly, I'm spraying them down with water first. This is the consistency of my render for the first coat, and I can load up the hawk and start getting it on the walls, and immediately I found I had problems. I chose plastering sand for this job because it's a fine, smooth sand, which is supposed to be ideal for rendering, but as you can see, there were quite a lot of big pebbles in it too, which really should not be there. But this is the sand that I had to hand, and with the mixing already done, I had no option but to use it. You can see from this footage just how quickly the aerated blocks suck up the moisture from the mix. It's already starting to dry out and you really do have to work quite quickly. So that's the scratch coat done. Now this has had a couple of days to dry, it all looks good. For the top coat I'm doing an even weaker mix. This is 6 sand to 1 cement, plus a bit of plasticizer, no integral waterproofer this time. And you can tell I'm not particularly good at this rendering malarkey. I'm dropping a lot on the floor, but to be honest it really shouldn't matter as this is all going to be covered up. And again, this is more about working quickly, so I just need to get the area covered so that I can move on to the pebble dashing. I found it was helpful to use a piece of wood to flatten it off as it takes away any high spots and smooths things out even more. And then it was the fun part, hurling stones at it. And for this I used 10mm gravel, and it's important to do this while the render is still nice and wet and loose, as otherwise the stones just don't embed themselves properly into the mix. Then I can concentrate on filling the areas around the edges, getting in there with a little filler knife, and then throwing some more stones on, and it's pretty forgiving stuff to work with as you can see. The impact of the stones hitting the render just kind of blends everything in nicely, so this part isn't difficult at all. I then spent some time cleaning up any excess render with a damp sponge and a hose. It's a couple of days later now, so it's all dry and I think it went okay. The second coat of render was a lot easier to apply than the scratch coat, and I think that's because I applied it a bit thicker, so the big bits of gravel in the sand wasn't so much of an issue. I'm not sure if this will come across on camera, but if I sight down the length of the wall from the side, I can see that the area that I rendered isn't perfectly true to the wall. If I offer up a straight edge to the wall, obviously it's difficult to get a reference for how big that gap is because Pebbledash by its very nature is very higgledy-piggledy. But I would say I'm probably 6 or 7mm out in both directions. So on with the paint which we had left over from painting the rest of the bungalow, and I'm using a deep pile roller for this. Painting Pebbledash is notoriously very difficult, but this tends to get most of it covered, but inevitably there's still a lot of areas that need touching up with a brush. And if you're wondering how many stones I lost, a few fell down, but actually it was about twice as many as this here, as there were quite a few stuck in the roller sleeve too, but not too bad really. Once everything was painted in, it kind of highlighted a few areas where I hadn't done a great job around the perimeter of the opening, so I actually came back and touched up a bit more right over the paint, and then painted it all again, and eventually I called the job done. And it blends in about as well as I could have hoped, I think. Obviously it was never going to look perfect because there are so many variables here. For example, the 10mm gravel that I used had some really small pebbles in, and the older render doesn't have that. And also the old render has about 5 coats of paint on it, whereas this only has 2. But it looks so much better than it did before, so for that reason I'm reasonably happy with it. If I were to do it again, I can't say there's too much I'd do differently other than buying a better quality rendering or plastering sand and maybe having a second pair of hands to apply the pebbles behind me as I was rendering. I thought it'd be interesting to compare the cost of DIYing this job with getting a builder to do it. And I'll start by saying that the quote I got for a builder to do this was really reasonable in my opinion, which was £280, including labour and materials, to get it done by a builder whose work we really highly regard. In total for materials, the cost was around £80, so I saved just over £200. Did I enjoy it? No, not really.